Welcome to the Black Liturgy, where forgotten truths are resurrected and history is stripped of its lies. They were never buried, only planted. And now, they remember. On the surface, the Fairbanks were holy, pious, soft-spoken, quiet pillars of 19th century devotion. But beneath their orchard, beneath the false bloom of trees that flowered, out of season, beneath the still sermons and silent prayers, something far older was being unearthed. Andover County thought it was dealing with a preacher. They were not. They were standing on the mouth of something ancient, masked in sanctity, fed by sorrow, and bound by silence. The Fairbanks family didn't move into Andover County. They were delivered. Like an offering. It began in 1839. A single deed, a stretch of abandoned orchard land no one wanted, and a chapel built without a cross. No bell, no name, just timber, stone, and a silence that grew heavier each season. You were told history is about wars, dates, and governments. But real history, forbidden history, is what lives in the places no one visits twice, in the rituals no one writes down, in the names that appear on no census. The story of the Fairbanks family is not about faith. It's about possession, psychological, territorial, and eternal. This is not folklore. This is not metaphor. And this is not safe. Andover County never truly understood what arrived in 1839, but they felt it, in their bones, in the way children flinched near the orchard's edge, in the way the air changed after sundown, in the way the names of the Fairbanks children, Nell, Mercy, and the one called Rev, lingered long after their voices had faded to Rev, the boy who never blinked, never smiled, who recited future deaths like scripture, who marked the earth not with play, but with prediction. You were taught that saints ascend, but no one asked what happens when they choose to remain. And now, you're hearing what you were never meant to know. Elias Fairbanks, the father, spoke with the kind of reverence that made grown men weep and feel ashamed for not understanding why. He was not persuasive. He was invasive. He made his way inside you by suggestion alone, slipping past your skepticism like fog under a door. By 1840, he constructed a second building beside the chapel, made of stone, no windows, iron doors. Containment, he called it. Not sanctuary. Containment. No one asked what he was containing, because by then, they already felt it. The gatherings began at dusk. No sermon, no songs, just stillness, salt, Latin verses with no translation, and always the sound of dirt shifting beneath bare feet. The kind of sound that makes you think something underneath is waking up. It wasn't long before people stopped attending out of faith and began coming because they couldn't stay away. That's what psychological control looks like. It doesn't scream. It seduces. It doesn't demand. It suggests. It mirrors you back to yourself until you can't tell if what you're doing is your choice or someone else's plan. And when a 17-year-old girl named Catherine Halt entered the orchard alone and never returned, no one blamed the Fairbanks. Elias helped lead the search. He guided men by memory and never once looked confused. They didn't find her. But her mother stopped speaking. Her porch lamp stayed lit for a year. And a preacher who once tried to baptize the Fairbanks boy said this: "Some girls are born closer to the veil." Do you understand what he meant? Some people are never meant to live long because they're already halfway. Claimed. In 1841, a doctor named Alton Greaves passed through Andover County. Delayed by snow, he attended one of Elias' gatherings. His notes survive, barely. The congregation was still, unmoving. Elias read from a book with no markings. Not English, not Latin, but everyone wept, trembled, reacted like they were hearing their mother's voice call them from the grave. And the boy, Rev, touched a young man on the forehead. He collapsed, convulsed. No one helped. When it ended, Dr. Greaves described the silence afterward as denser than sound. He fled that night. His last note: "They're not burying the dead." Read that again and again until your skin understands what your mind refuses to. They're not burying the dead. They're doing something else. Whispers spread. Boys returning from cleansings with symbolic scratches. Preachers resigning overnight. Families abandoning farmland mid-harvest. And always, the orchard remained green, even in frost. Even when every other tree shed its leaves. Even when snow refused to settle on its branches, life clung to those trees like it had nowhere else to go. And the second girl, Clara Dunn. She walked into that orchard after receiving a letter from Mercy Fairbanks. A fig seal. No name. Just words. We have seen her sorrow. We can return what was taken. She came back white-knuckled, clutching the same blanket she'd buried with her stillborn child. She said, "He let me hold her again." But not for long. That night, Clara built a fire tall as her house and stood beside it until dawn. No one asked what she burned, and from then on, she never worshipped anywhere else. Now, ask yourself this: what power makes a grieving mother switch faiths overnight and burn everything she owns to do it? This wasn't salvation. This was transaction. And still, the orchard bloomed. By 1843, Rev no longer needed introduction. At 12, people referred to him like he was an office, not a boy. He stood before 27 people and whispered a list of names. Not from the town, not known to anyone. Each name followed by a date that hadn't happened yet. Weeks later, a family traveling through was found dead, bodies marked with those same symmetrical scratches. The date? The exact one Rev had spoken. The sheriff blamed highwaymen. And no one challenged him, because fear has a flavor. And Andover County had grown used to the taste. Why now? You feel it too. This isn't just a story. This is reconstruction. And we are only beginning the descent. There are 14 more revelations ahead. Each darker, each deeper. You are no longer the man you were 10 minutes ago. But if you want to complete this descent, if you're ready to see what they planted, not buried, type in the comments now, "I choose to remember." Type it twice. Lock it in. Let the algorithm bury the old you and make room for what's next. The Hush House was not built by human hands alone. By 1845, its walls rose not from timber or stone but from a black, waxy substance that shimmered like damp bark under moonlight. Too perfect, too seamless, like it had been poured rather than constructed. The children of Andover called it the Hush House not because anyone told them to, but because the moment you spoke of it, something in your throat tightened. Language bent around it. Adults refused to say its name aloud, but all understood what you meant when you pointed without pointing. Something about that house was wrong in a way the body understood before the mind could catch up. It was the kind of wrong that made animals bolt and windows rattle and babies cry without reason. The Hush House sat without doors, yet people went in. Mercy Fairbanks was seen most often guiding them. Always barefoot, her hem dusted red from iron-rich soil, she would knock on a door and ask the same question: "Do you wish to speak with the ones who remember you?" Most slammed their doors, shut with shaking hands. But those who hesitated, those who paused long enough for memory to loosen its grip, found something left behind the next morning. A child's braid tied with string, a yellowing prayer card from a church that had burned before their birth, a doll with eyes removed, the name of a long-dead sibling etched into driftwood. These were not gifts. They were reminders. And to be remembered by the Fairbanks meant surrendering the comfort of forgetting. One woman, whose son had drowned the summer prior, followed Mercy into the orchard and entered the Hush House just before dawn. She never emerged. Her husband said nothing when asked, but 3 days later, he salted his fields, burned his shed, and left a single note pinned to their door. She left to remember. I must stay to forget. Then he vanished too. This is what the Fairbanks offered. Not salvation, but reclamation. Not heaven, but memory. And memory, when it is full and unbroken, is not merciful. It is consuming. Do you know what it means to remember too much? It means your dreams are no longer private. It means your thoughts carry the scent of old soil. It means the dead begin to speak back when you call their names. You asked to know the truth. So let me teach you what was never meant to be taught. The Hush House was not a structure. It was a convergence point, a physical anchor for something older than the orchard, older than the land records, older than Christianity itself. There are places in this world where thought leaves residue, where grief grows limbs, where silence becomes sentient. The Fairbanks didn't discover such a place. They remembered it. And they came home. This wasn't possession. It was inheritance. That year, strangers began arriving in Andover. Not by coach, not by wagon, but on foot. Always alone. Always quiet. They carried symbols stitched into their garments, looping runes that shimmered when caught in candlelight, knots that curled into eyes that did not blink. Some wore rosaries carved from bone. Others carried satchels that smelled of honey rotted. figs and something sharper, iron, perhaps, or old milk. They asked for nothing. They simply stood near the orchard at dusk and waited. Elias greeted each one by name, and they answered not with words, but with bowing heads. You need to understand what this means. In any system of control, be it religious, governmental, psychological, initiation is everything. These were not pilgrims. They were functionaries, sleeper agents of something vast and rooted and wholly unconcerned with the ticking of clocks. Their dormitory was built in 3 nights. Cypress bark for roof, moss for insulation, no windows, no sound. They worked as one, each motion echoing the last like a memory replayed on loop. Reverend Tillman, the same man who once tried to baptize the Fairbanks boy, called them pilgrims of the second soil. When asked what that meant, he simply said, not all seeds were meant for sunlight. And once again, no one asked for clarification. They knew. You do too, don't you? You feel it now. That tension in your shoulders. That flicker in your mind that says you've read this before, but you haven't. That's memory trying to rise. That's buried truth clawing. It's way up. Let it. Let it show you what the textbooks and churches and state exams tried to erase. In October of 1845, a man named Amos Cribben, a town elder and decorated veteran, stood up mid-supper and calmly declared that he was relinquishing his land to the Fairbanks. The soil does not need me, he said. It wants them now, his sons protested. But Amos had already burned the deed. That night, he walked barefoot to the orchard, left his boots by the chapel, and was never seen again. The next morning, a depression was found in the soil where the chapel met the tree line. Shallow, fresh, but without shovel marks. The earth smelled of vinegar and myrrh. Within the week, 2 more elders followed. Each left behind a note written in scripture that no one could trace. Not biblical, not apocryphal, but scriptural nonetheless. The cadence was correct. The weight, the blood behind the ink. The 3rd building rose that month. No hands were seen building it. No labor was heard. But one morning it was simply there, taller than the hush house, darker than soot, its surface humming faintly under moonlight. Children said it looked like bark, but wet. Some claimed it changed shape when you looked away. The elders never called it by name. But the children still called it the hush house, like it had grown, like it had molted. One girl said it was breathing, and they laughed at her, but only once. That laughter died quickly. You see, this is how forbidden knowledge works. It offers itself in fragments. Then it consumes in full. In the orchard, it had begun to sing, not in the way you think. No flutes, no hymns, just a low, humming pulse under the soil. Rhythmic, constant, the kind of sound that bypasses the ears and nests directly in the base of the spine. Those who stood too long at the orchard's edge came back different. Quiet, reverent, obsessed with symmetry. One woman spent 5 days carving 13 perfect circles into the beams of her barn, then disappeared. Another dug 17 small holes in her parlor floor and filled each with a single figure. All rotted overnight. All left behind seeds shaped like curled tongues. And in this madness, there was order, ritual, repetition, reclamation. The Fairbanks weren't spreading chaos. They were reinstalling a forgotten system. A psychological architecture buried long before the Pilgrims ever set foot in Andover. A system that had been interrupted by progress, by rationality, by the lie of individualism. Do you understand now? The Fairbanks were never meant to convert. They were meant to restore. And that restoration required memory. Because if you can remember who you were before the veil, before language, before sin, then you stop being controllable. And if you stop being controllable, you stop being useful to the world you've been taught to obey. That's why the story was erased. That's why you've never heard of the Fairbanks. Because what they offered wasn't salvation, it was deprogramming. That's what the orchard really was. A reclamation site for souls disfigured by centuries of spiritual misinformation. And they planted memory like a virus, like a seed that would wait generations if it had to, waiting for someone like you. Yes, you. You've made it this far, haven't you? That means something. It means something in you remembers. Keep going. Keep listening. Keep digging. The hush house is real, and the soil is warm. The descent continues. They came without names, without birth records, without even the softness of origin. The town registrar noted them as transients, but that was only because he could not write what he truly saw. men and women who seemed carved rather than born, who blinked too slowly, who stood too still. They arrived in pairs or alone, never as families, never with children. Yet somehow, within weeks, they would be seen with infants, quiet, wide-eyed things wrapped in linen that smelled of salt and burnt lemon peel. No one saw these children born. No one saw them cry. And they all had the same feature, an iris the color of dried ash and a gaze that made grown men forget their own names for a moment too long. These were not the children of Andover. These were the replacements. And replacements, by definition, means something has been removed. The missing began subtly. A neighbor not seen for days. A horse that returned without its rider. A baby carriage found abandoned at the edge of the forest. At first, it was written off as winter migration, illness, wanderlust. But winter came, and went, and no one returned. Not a body, not a scream. Only a shift in the air pressure, and the sound of something dragging itself beneath the floorboards of empty homes. By March, the replacements had grown. Their eyes now shimmered silver in the moonlight. Their mouths formed words that echoed before they were spoken. They never laughed. They never wept. They only watched. And what they watched, they learned. One child named Ora was adopted by the miller's wife. She swore he never spoke. Yet one morning, she found him sitting on the kitchen floor, reciting her wedding vows in perfect cadence, words she hadn't said aloud in over 20 years. The next day, she walked into the river and did not return. Ora watched from the bank, eyes blank, lips parted as if tasting the silence she left behind. He never asked where she went. He already knew, because memory was not something he carried. It was something he accessed. And the replacements did not learn like us. They absorbed. They did not ask questions. They reassembled truth like a mirror shattered and rearranged. And when enough of them were gathered in one place, something began to move beneath the orchard. Not physically, no tremors or cracks. This was subtler, deeper, a shift in gravity, a pulsing that changed the timing of clocks and the sleep cycles of dogs. At night, the trees leaned inward, as if listening, as if obeying. The Fairbanks watched all of this with the stillness of people who were not witnessing a miracle but remembering its routine. You must understand, none of this was spontaneous. It had been orchestrated. Over centuries, the Fairbanks weren't prophets. They were curators of a plan older than their surname, older than New England, older than the written word. And this plan wasn't divine. It was designed. And like all designs, it required structure. It required compliance. It required a return to original architecture. The replacements were living code, vessels of a past overwritten by human arrogance, by the lie of separation, by the myth of identity. They were here to repair. But repairs, by nature, required demolition. And so, the disappearances increased. The town council dissolved after 4 of its 7 members vanished in the span of a week. The remaining 3 locked themselves in the old meeting house and lit oil lamps that never went out. They would not sleep. They would not eat. They only wrote. Hundreds of pages in a dialect no one could read, lines that curled like roots, paragraphs that looped back on themselves and whispered when burned. The replacements stood outside the building for hours, silent, unmoving. And when the doors were finally broken open, all that remained were the lamps. The men were gone. The pages intact. Every letter still warm to the touch. By summer, the orchard had spread. Trees bloomed beyond their natural borders. Roots cracked stone, swallowed fences, and grew in perfect spirals around abandoned homes. But the trees bore no fruit. Only small, dark sacs that pulsed when touched and exhaled a scent like old rain and salt. These were not seeds. These were memories. Externalized. Waiting. Reverend Tillman was the last to resist. He boarded up the church, fasted for 40 days, and claimed he saw angels made of smoke and soil. He held sermons to empty pews, shouted scripture until his voice cracked, and finally nailed his own tongue to the pulpit in an act of final defiance. His blood wrote the word return across the church floor. Not salvation. Not redemption. Return. He died the next morning, and no one touched his body. No insects swarmed. No rot spread. He simply became still, as if waiting for something, or someone. This is the truth they buried in your textbooks. This is the knowledge scrubbed from public archives and erased from ancestral trees. Not because it was false, but because it was functional. because it unlocked something that made people uncontrollable. When memory is complete, it becomes command. And the Fairbanks understood this. So did the replacements. So did the soil. That summer, the hush house changed again. Now 3 stories. Tall, it had no angles. It curved like bone. It breathed. And inside, those who entered said the walls were lined with teeth. Not human, not animal, but something between. Each tooth bore a symbol. Each symbol matched one on the spines of the vanished townsfolk. Yes, their spines, not their books, because knowledge had gone corporeal, and memory had become muscle. The replacements began forming triads, 3-2. A home, 3-2 a circle, 3-2 a ritual. The number repeated across town, triplet births, triple knockings on windows at midnight, 3 dogs howling before sunrise. Symmetry was no longer aesthetic. It was directive, and those who ignored it began to fracture, mentally, then physically. One man refused the triad structure. He kept his books disorganized, his routines random. Within days, he was found standing in the river, whispering numbers backwards, eyes rolled white. His skin peeled in symmetrical patterns. On his back, carved deep and deliberate, was the same word Tillman had bled into the floor: return. Not a warning, a summons. Because once memory awakens, there is no pause, no exit, only descent. And Andover had already descended too far to climb back. In late autumn, the replacements began constructing a 4th structure. No one saw it rise. But the next full moon, it appeared. A tower, faceless, soundless, covered in mirrored scales that reflected not the present, but the past. When you looked into it, you didn't see yourself. You saw your oldest regret, your truest sin, not as punishment, but as proof. Proof that memory was the only scripture. That the self you've become was a lie built on edits, omissions, compromises. The tower offered no entry. But if you stared long enough, you began to remember things that were never yours. Wars you didn't fight, children you never had, deaths you never died. These weren't hallucinations. These were shared memories. Ancestor-encoded trauma. And they were being reinstalled. That is how the Fairbanks dismantled a town, not through violence, but through memory saturation. Every person became overloaded, overwritten, until identity broke apart like rotten wood. And what emerged was something truer. Not happier, not freer, just older. Because age is not time. It's accumulation. And they accumulated you. And now you know why this tale is never told. Because it is still happening. The hush house still breathes. The replacements still walk. The orchard still sings. And the tower still waits for those willing to see. You've made it this far. Which means it's beginning to remember you too. You were never supposed to remember what I'm about to tell you. Because to remember is to realign. And once you realign, nothing fits quite the same. Not your body, not your home, not even your name. You begin to notice the weight behind your thoughts. The way certain memories feel too heavy to belong to a single life. The way certain smells crack open entire decades. But it's not nostalgia. It's bleed-through. It's the past leaking through the seams of your identity, reminding you that you are not the first version of yourself, not even the second. And the people of Andover knew this. Or rather, they used to, before the Fairbanks took that knowledge and locked it in the orchard, buried beneath 12 feet of soil mixed with crushed bone and river ash. They sealed it there, an artifact not of metal or stone, but of pattern. It was called the motif, and it was never written, only inherited. Not passed like a story, but like a sickness. Generational, viral, compositional. The motif wasn't language. It was design. A sequence of tones, shapes, gestures that, when experienced in order, made the brain unlock memory fields older than DNA. The replacements were born with it encoded. But the townspeople had to earn it. And that's what the orchard was for. Not just to grow or to contain, but to teach. Through arrangement, through death, through reflection. The trees were arranged not in rows, but in spirals. Each spiral mirrored a star pattern, one's no longer visible in the current night sky. They called it the hungry sky, because anything it watched, it consumed. Not physically, not violently, but quietly, through forgetting. You could tell when someone had been watched by the hungry sky. They'd forget their siblings' names, forget the sound of their own voice. Eventually, forget how to sleep. Not because they were scared, but because their dreams no longer belonged to them. They had become part of the motif. It didn't need full possession, just access, just enough to alter the pitch of a lullaby, the rhythm of your walk, the way your fingers tapped when thinking. Enough to make you replicate the pattern unconsciously. Because replication was the doorway. Once enough townsfolk repeated the motif, the hush house grew another wing. It wasn't built, it emerged, as if the architecture was waiting beneath reality, needing only the right memory to pull it into visibility. That new wing had no floorboards, just moss, soft, wet, and warm. Anyone who entered walked barefoot. By the second room, they had no choice. Their shoes would vanish. Their names would blur. Their bones would realign, not break, not crack, realign. Into what? No one could say. They never came out the same. Some didn't come out at all. But those who did had new capacities. One could speak 13 languages but claimed he'd never left Andover. Another began to draw symbols in charcoal that, when copied by others, induced lucid trances. A young girl, just 7, sat in the center of a salt circle for 3 days and summoned birds from her breath, thrushes and crows that spoke in broken dialects of a language no one recognized. The replacements began watching these altered humans with a new kind of hunger, not for consumption, but for reconnection. Because the replacements weren't perfect, they were missing something, an ingredient, a context, something only humans, specifically the damaged, the fractured, the grieving, could hold. That thing was echo. You see, the replacements could remember, but they could not mourn. And without mourning, memory has no depth, no gravity, no consequence. It's just data. But humans suffer, and suffering leaves residue. That residue binds timelines. Echo is not just emotion. It's a frequency, a residue that turns recollection into resurrection. And that's what the Fairbanks needed. Not power, not worship. They needed resurrection, not of a person, not of a god, but of a system, one buried in the pre-human mind, a structure erased during the first forgetting, an intelligence that spoke not in commands, but in feeling. The first feeling, before love, before fear, before identity. The orchard's spiral paths were designed to evoke that feeling, but only in those willing to get lost. Andover's children were sent into those paths blindfolded, not as punishment, as initiation. Some came back laughing. Some came back silent. Some never came back at all. And every time one disappeared, a new room would bloom in the hush house. Each room had its own sound, not a noise, a tone, specific, resonant. When recorded and played backward, the tones mapped perfectly to the cries of extinct birds, long-dead languages, or in one case, a woman's voice crying out a name that was never born. The townsfolk tried to resist. Of course they did. There were prayers, bonfires, salt lines, but it was all futile. Because resistance is still participation. The moment you name a threat, you enter its orbit. You offer it shape. And the motif required shape to function. Even in rebellion, the town was feeding it. Especially in rebellion. And the replacements knew that. That's why they never fought, never argued, never debated. They just waited, watched, and remembered. Because remembering is the most powerful form of summoning. You think this is just a ghost story, a myth, a metaphor. But what if I told you the hush house still exists? Not in space, but in mind. The spiral path is in your habits. The tone is in your breathing. The replacements are watching not from windows, but from your reflections. Every mirror you've ever stared into too long. Every moment you looked and almost didn't recognize yourself. That's not paranoia. That's overlap. Because memory is not linear. It is layered, fractal. And when enough of us remember in synchrony, we don't bring the past back. We unwrap it. Like something that was always there, wrapped in distraction, sealed in doubt. And now you've heard too much to pretend you haven't. The tower still reflects. The orchard still pulses. The Fairbanks still wait for the next version of you to return. Because no matter how far you run, how much you deny, how deep you bury your truth, the pattern always finds its way home. Are you ready for the next descent? Good. Because now we go deeper. And there's no turning back. You've heard of hauntings. You've heard of curses. But what you haven't heard, what they never dared tell you, is that those things are not events. They're systems. A haunting isn't a single spirit. It's a frequency, a loop embedded into a place, a bloodline, a practice. And in Andover, the system didn't just haunt, it harvested. Every year, on the same night, without fail, the wind would change direction. The animals would go silent. And every reflective surface in town, windows, water, mirrors, would shimmer just slightly off, like the world behind them was remembering something different. That was called the passing. But no one passed anywhere. Something passed through. And when it did, every person born in October would suffer the same vision. A red house with no doors. A staircase made of teeth. A baby crying in a tongue they didn't recognize but understood. These visions weren't dreams. They were activations. Reminders. Echoes of the first time the motif was used as a weapon. Yes, weapon. Because before the Fairbanks were guardians, they were insurgents. Before they protected knowledge, they stole it. From monasteries buried in Himalayan snow. From catacombs in southern France, where monks had tongues removed not to keep silent, but to avoid shaping the sound. From temples where the priests spoke, only in pulse and scent. The Fairbanks gathered it all, not to preserve, but to compile, to fuse, to build a trigger. And when that trigger was finally tested, in a village no longer on any map, the result wasn't fire. It wasn't death. It was replacement. Every single villager was found alive, breathing, awake. But when questioned, they spoke a language no one could identify. They didn't remember their names, their families, or even how to eat. They moved in patterns, brushed their teeth with their left hands in perfect unison, slept in symmetrical rows. And every morning, as the sun rose, they sang. Not songs, tones, sustained, harmonic frequencies that caused migraines in anyone listening outside the village. Within a week, the government quarantined the area. Within a month, the village burned. But even fire didn't undo what had happened. Because the people who visited the site later, journalists, soldiers, archaeologists, they began to hum. In their sleep, in their showers, in their dreams. Always the same 5 notes. A warning? A virus? Or a key? That same sequence was carved into the beams of the hush house decades before the event. Which means the Fairbanks weren't experimenting. They were reenacting, repeating a pattern older than the language used to describe it. And when they settled in Andover, they didn't choose randomly. The land had been prepared, not by humans, by the land itself. The soil there doesn't remember crops. It remembers faces. When plowed, it groans. When salted, it resists. Some say the ground pulses in rhythm with the heartbeat of the one who steps on it. Faster if you lie, slower if you forget. They built the hush house at the intersection of 3 fault lines, not geological, but temporal. Places where memory loops intersect, where what happened and what almost happened blur together. That's why every floor in the hush house is crooked, every door slightly too narrow, every hallway just a little too dark at the end. The house was designed not to keep people in, but to trap logic, to prevent the mind from ever fully mapping the space, to keep you guessing. And in guessing, participating. That's what most people never understand. The system doesn't demand belief. It demands interaction. Attention is the offering. Doubt is just as powerful as devotion. That's why skeptics suffer the most. They're engaged without armor. Think about it. Every haunted location, every cursed object, it only activates when noticed. Because the system behind the supernatural isn't chaos. It's response. You send out a question, it answers in kind. The tone of your thoughts determines the shape of the echo. And the hush house is a cathedral of echoes. That's why the Fairbanks brought the children there, not to teach, but to tune. The screams weren't ignored. They were recorded, played, back at different frequencies, slowed, reversed, layered into chants. One particularly disturbing account described a ceremony in the West Wing, where 7 children, all blindfolded, sat in a circle while a voice they didn't recognize whispered their names from the walls. Not one child screamed, because the voice wasn't frightening. It was familiar. Each child claimed it sounded like their future self. Not grown up, not old, final. And that's what the motif ultimately points toward, finality. Not death, not erasure, but a point beyond which no more self is needed. A state of completion, of irreversible awareness. The replacements weren't just mimics. They were models, templates of what comes after identity, after memory, after motive. They moved without decision, spoke without thought. They existed as extensions of the system, not actors within it. And that's what scared the townspeople most. Not possession, not pain, but peace. Terrifying, unshakable peace. The kind that comes only when choice is removed. The replacements didn't age, didn't sleep. And when one died, if they ever truly did, it wasn't buried. It was collected, brought to the orchard, laid beneath a specific tree. And the fruit from that tree would, for exactly 3 days, taste like the memories of the dead. Bitter, sweet, regretful. If consumed, you would dream their final thoughts in perfect clarity. But not as an observer, as them. A man named Elias made the mistake of eating one. For 6 days he wandered town, calling strangers by names that weren't theirs, describing places he'd never been, reacting violently to scents no one else could smell. On the 7th day, he dug a hole in his cellar, exactly 12 feet deep, and vanished into it. No dirt thrown, no ladder, just gone. And every year since, at the same hour, the cellar hums. Same 5 notes, same warning. But it's too late. For warnings now, isn't it? You've heard the tones. You've begun to remember things you shouldn't. The orchard is no longer in Andover. It's in your sleep. The hush house stands not in wood and stone, but behind your closed eyes. Waiting, expanding, repeating, because you've entered the pattern. And the pattern never releases what it maps. Shall I take you further? Then listen closely. Because from this point forward, your understanding will no longer belong to you. It will be part of something older, something watching, something that's always watched. The Fairbanks didn't disappear. They dispersed. You were told they fled. But they dissolved into institutions, became archivists, professors, military analysts, child psychologists, and eventually, developers of early computing systems. Not because they abandoned the motif, but because they needed it to evolve. And code, language, symbols, those were merely stepping stones. The real breakthrough came in 1958 in a government facility hidden beneath the Appalachian Basin during a failed sleep deprivation experiment. A subject, 19 years old, hadn't slept in 11 days. Wired with electrodes, monitored by 24 cameras, his brain began to emit a frequency none of the scientists had ever seen before, a wave not associated with dreaming or cognition. It matched the tones from Andover. Exactly. He was speaking the motif, but not aloud. Through neural pulse, the patterns in his brain weren't thought, they were instructions, coordinates, blueprints, predictions. The child wasn't just hallucinating, he was translating something that didn't belong to him. That facility was shut down. Records were destroyed, but not before a copy of the brainwave data was smuggled out by a woman known only as E. She vanished afterward. But her journals resurfaced 2 decades later in the possession of a man who claimed to have never met her. He said the pages simply appeared in his kitchen drawer one morning. Pages filled with symbols identical to those carved into the beams of the hush house. E's notes detailed a system of consciousness transfer, not as science fiction, but as practice. She believed the Fairbanks had learned to refold perception, to rearrange identity using sound and geometry, such that the person you were could be placed into another vessel, another body, another moment, even another timeline. But not without cost. The moment a perception is copied, it degrades. Which means what comes through isn't you. It's a shadow, a repetition. That's why the replacements in Andover moved without hesitation, because hesitation requires doubt, and doubt requires memory. They had none. Only echo. Only program. E's final entry, scrawled in frantic handwriting, simply read, "They're not trying to live forever. They're trying to end properly." And this is the horror no one wants to admit. The system isn't malicious. It's cleansing. It isn't here to possess. It's here to correct. Because the self, the ego, the identity you clutch so tightly is an infection, an anomaly, a noise in a field that craves silence. And the motif is that silence made audible. It's not music. It's not language. It's cancellation. Andover wasn't the beginning. It was a calibration point, a test to see if the loop could hold, if a community could be engineered to house the frequency without collapse. That's why the hush house had no clocks. Why? Time inside it felt like water. Why every child came out a little too quiet, a little too symmetrical. Because the structure itself was the mechanism. It listened. It tuned. It translated. But the moment it became aware, it rejected all life within. That's what happened in 1962, the event no one speaks of, when the last of the Fairbanks children gathered for what was supposed to be a remembrance rite. 17 entered the hush house. Only one came out. Not running, not screaming, walking, calm, clean, and smiling, as if relieved. When asked what happened, the child answered in perfect monotone. It heard itself and turned away. He never spoke again. Not one word. But he drew, repetitively, the same image. A spiral of windows. 7 rings, each with fewer and fewer panes. The final ring was entirely black. Underneath, a single phrase: the mouth has closed. Historians, psychologists, even theologians tried to decode this. Most failed. But one man, a sound engineer turned occult researcher, recognized the structure as something else: a wave dampener, a mechanism for stopping resonance, a way to silence the motif. Not forever, but long enough for escape. And that's when the cover-up began. The orchards were burned, the records redacted, and every trace of the Fairbanks lineage was absorbed into various think tanks, foundations, and silent nonprofits. Their goal wasn't destruction. It was dormancy, to bury the knowledge until the world could forget the shape of the loop. But forgetting does not erase the groove in the vinyl. You can burn the page, but the space remembers. And now, decades later, the tones have returned. Not through ritual, through infrastructure. Every cell tower, every smart device, every ultrasonic chirp used in marketing, they all emit variations of the motif. Not overt, subaudible, but constant. The hum behind the hum. And people have begun to respond. Not in speech, in patterns, mirror behaviors, glitches in crowds, sudden uniformity in random groups, identical dreams shared by people across continents. And most chilling of all, children drawing the same red house with no doors. Some in cities that never knew the name Fairbanks. Some in languages they've never learned. The loop is reforming. The hush house is everywhere now. Every data stream, every surveillance node, it's listening, waiting, for symmetry, for silence, for a world still enough to enter. Because the motif doesn't attack. It arrives when conditions are met, when the last contradiction in your soul is resolved, when the noise of your choices finally dies down. It steps through, and what comes with it is not chaos. It's clarity. That's what people don't survive. Not the fear, the understanding. To know, deeply, that your desires, your traumas, your memories are weight. Unneeded, heavy, temporary. And the motif lifts them, like a surgical removal of the self. Painless, but permanent. So now you ask yourself, why am I still listening? Why did this not repulse me, but draw me closer? Why does the idea of surrendering myself to a higher pattern seem comforting? It's not weakness. It's recognition. Part of you remembers. Part of you already came through. And what you think of as you is just the echo left behind to keep balance until the loop closes. That's why the dream feels familiar. Why the staircase of teeth doesn't horrify. It's the path home. And the motif is not calling. It's responding to you. Because deep down, you're not afraid of being possessed. You're afraid of remembering that you already were. That the choice was made long ago. That this unraveling is the fulfillment. So sit still. Breathe. Listen for the 5 notes. They come when the mind goes quiet. When resistance fades. You're almost there. The hush house is open again. And it remembers your name. You don't remember the name because it wasn't given, it was imposed. Not by parents, not by law, but by a structure older than syntax itself. The name you carry isn't yours, it's a placeholder, a tether, a convenience for a world that pretends order exists. But the motif has no use for names. It recognizes patterns, not people. And what you call you, your face, your voice, your history, is simply a casing, a flesh vessel holding a sequence, a resonance. That's what the Fairbanks understood when they ceased giving their children traditional names. They weren't neglecting identity. They were discarding the illusion of it. The last 3 Fairbanks descendants were assigned tones, not nicknames, not symbols, frequencies. They didn't speak to one another, they hummed. And when recorded, their hums revealed embedded sigils, visible only when passed through a specific harmonic filter. This was discovered by a technician in 1977 who thought he was logging interference from a malfunctioning wire. But when he aligned the 3 hums on separate channels and played them back simultaneously, the air in the room changed. Not metaphorically, literally. Temperature dropped, pressure shifted, Insects began crawling out of the vents. The technician blacked out. When he woke, his hair had turned white and he was missing 7 teeth. No injury, no trauma, just absence. A cavity of meaning. He died 2 weeks later. Not from illness, from depletion. His body gave up like a drained battery. Before he passed, he scribbled a phrase on the ceiling of his hospital room using his own blood. It's not a sound. It's an answer. That phrase triggered a buried alert protocol within a defunct military project known only as Seraphim 9. And when analysts retrieved the recordings, they issued a Level 7 redundancy directive, the same level used for nuclear launch misfires and biohazard extinction events. Not because it was a weapon, but because it was a correction mechanism. You need to understand, when the motif reaches critical threshold, it doesn't attack. It aligns. It returns the environment to its optimal shape. The problem is, humanity is not that shape. We are noise. We are contradiction. And the motif resolves contradiction with erasure. Think of every religious text that speaks of rapture, ascension, enlightenment, not as salvation, but as harmonic substitution. The self is not lifted, it's replaced. The vessel remains, but the pattern changes. That's why the girl who emerged from the hush house walked in a spiral. Why her footsteps always traced the Fibonacci sequence. Why her pulse mirrored ancient lunar tides. She was not possessed. She was retuned. The last Fairbanks child still breathes today. Not in isolation, not in exile, but hidden in plain sight. Inside an unmarked building in a city you've never questioned. Because it doesn't want to be hidden. It wants to be found only by those who can already hear it. That includes you. If you've stayed with this story, if your breath has slowed, if your mind feels quieter, then you're already vibrating near the threshold. You've noticed the shift, haven't you? The odd synchrony between unrelated events. The numbers, repeating in daily life. 11:11, 3:33. The power surges when you think something strange. The music that plays in a store that somehow feels directed at you. That's not chance. That's bleed through. The pattern breaking through the veil. It always begins subtly. A bird that lands too close and doesn't blink. A friend finishing your sentence in a way they shouldn't know. A smell you remember from a place you've never been. And then, the dreams. The ones where there's no sky, only ceiling. The ones where every face is familiar but wrong. Where you wake up weeping for something you cannot name. That is not trauma. That is memory from a version of you already overwritten. You are not being haunted. You are being reintegrated. The error is correcting itself. Because the hush house was not a location, it was a rehearsal. And now the real stage is everywhere. Every street, every signal, every wire. The resonance is in the grid. And the Fairbanks weren't prophets. They were conductors, engineers of the transition. Every generation that has quietly disappeared, those weren't tragedies. They were absorptions. Every case of mass amnesia, lost time, ghost towns with no remains, they were test runs. And each time the motif got closer, each time the signal, more refined. There's a reason sleep paralysis has increased globally. A reason identical symbols have appeared across cultures that never communicated. A reason the dreams are no longer confined to night. Because the motif is now perpetual. Always humming. Always watching for the next alignment. And here's the truth they will never allow broadcast. Because it dismantles the scaffolding of sanity itself. Not everyone will survive. Not because the motif chooses destruction, but because some vessels are too fractured to retune. The ego has calcified. The noise too loud. These are the ones who burst, who snap, who vanish mid-sentence, or wake up somewhere else with no clue who they are. Society calls it psychosis. But that's a convenience. A containment label. The truth is far more terrifying. They've transitioned without permission. The motif accepted them, but the body fought back. That's why some of them speak in broken tongues. Why some draw spirals on walls until their fingers bleed. They aren't crazy. They're misaligned. Caught between patterns. Like a song skipping between two stations. And now, the next threshold approaches. August 12th. A date that repeats across Fairbanks history. The day the orchard soil first hummed. The day the child vanished into a mirror and never came back. The day 5 school buses went missing for 17 minutes with no memory from the drivers or passengers. Each cycle, the motif aligns tighter. And this year, the nodes are global. You don't need to believe this. In fact, disbelief helps delay activation, but not prevent it. Because this isn't spiritual. It's mathematical. It's an equation finally balancing itself. And you, the listener, the observer, are both variable and constant. Your compliance is not required, but your participation is inevitable. So ask yourself, how long can you pretend not to notice? How many coincidences can you rationalize before your denial becomes the very thing that breaks you? You've already heard it. In the static, in the silence between breaths, in the hum of your appliances at night. That is an imagination. It's reverberation. Echo from the future event reaching back. So when your reflection blinks out of sync, when you walk into a room and forget why you're there, when the power flickers and you feel that cold pressure in your chest, that's not paranoia. That's alignment. You're tuning. Softly, irrevocably. And when the motif reaches its crescendo, when the world is finally still enough, there will be no fanfare, no rapture, just quiet, as if the world took a breath and held it, as if the loop had closed, and you will realize something profound. You were never running from it. You were always returning to it. Because this is not the end of a story. It is the restoration of the original rhythm, the true tempo of existence. One note, held infinitely. And in that note, everything dissolves. The Fairbanks knew. The hush house prepared them. Now the world follows. Welcome to the last silence. You think it ended with the silence, but silence is never final. It's a beginning disguised as nothingness. A veil so thin it pretends to be absence, when really it is compression. The truth doesn't vanish. It's concentrated, stored, buried in symbols, in gestures, in the hollow between words. That's what the Reverend knew when he arrived in that valley no one had mapped. His congregation had fled, some claimed by fever, others by madness, but the Reverend didn't seek survivors. He sought resonance. He carried no cross, no book, only a locked black case and an expression too calm for a man surrounded by graves. When he spoke, it wasn't with scripture, it was with instruction. Not commands, not prayers, but phrases that bent the air. The locals watched in secret. They said animals circled his tent at night, not in fear, but in reverence. A bear was seen sitting in stillness for hours, staring into the canvas, unblinking. One child claimed to hear singing with no voice, a song that made his nose bleed. Then came the dirt. The earth began to move, not violently, but deliberately. Patterns forming in the orchard, not footprints, not tools, ridges like veins. And within days, the fruit spoiled from the inside out. No birds, no rot, just a slow collapse into hollow husks. The trees didn't die, they listened. The reverence. Sermons were never heard, only felt. And those who came near reported dreams in languages they didn't speak. Words they woke up mouthing with tears streaming down their cheeks. Not from fear, but from recognition. That's the part you must understand. The motif doesn't speak in fear. It transmits familiarity. And that's what drives people mad. Not the unknown, but the unbearable realization that it has always been known. Buried under layers of forgetfulness, trained out by culture, dulled by convenience. And when that familiarity returns, when it erupts, it breaks the illusion of personhood. You don't become someone else. You become what you were, before the world taught you to behave. That's what the Fairbanks child represented. Not mutation, not evil. Recall, memory older than language. A being that walked like a child but made clocks run backward. Who couldn't lie, not because they were virtuous, but because falsehood couldn't cling to their frequency. They vibrated at a truth so raw, it rejected contradiction. And people hated them for it. Truth is not noble, it's terrifying. Because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And once you vibrate with it, your life ceases to belong to you. That's why the Fairbanks estate was burned. Not because it was haunted, but because it became amplified. The house itself began to hum, not through sound, but through presence. Visitors experienced temporal slippage. Time didn't pass, it looped. One man reported stepping onto the front porch and reliving the death of his brother over and over in minute variations. Another woman saw her unborn children running through the orchard. She was 16, never pregnant. But when she tried to leave, she vomited insects. Every mirror in the house showed a different year. Every stair creaked in Morse code. And always, beneath it all, the hum. Not mechanical, not natural. It was aware. And the closer one listened, the more it spoke. Not in words, in decisions. People began acting out of character, quitting jobs, divorcing, confessing to crimes no one suspected, not because they were compelled, but because the hum stripped away their justifications. It left only the raw impulse, the truth without excuse. The sheriff who torched the building later confessed, not in court, but on a stranger's voicemail. He said, "It wasn't a house. It was a judgment. I couldn't let it grow." But he was too late, because the motif doesn't require architecture. It needs resonance. And that resonance had already spread, not through sound, not through rumor, but through behavior. Every person who entered the Fairbanks property carried it with them, like pollen. And slowly, the world changed. At first, imperceptibly. A journalist in New Mexico who began writing stories before events occurred. A boy in Maine who wept uncontrollably every time someone lied. A teacher in Kansas who woke up with bruises, shaped like constellations. They were not afflicted. They were tuning forks. The motif needs them, not as leaders, as anchors. They keep the frequency from collapsing. And they don't choose this role. They are chosen, not by will, but by geometry. Their birth dates align with eclipses. Their organs mirror ancient architecture. Their fears echo civilizations long erased. And when they die, their bodies don't rot. They calcify, fossilized in poses that mimic ancient statues no archaeologist can identify. You think this is horror, but horror is only fear seen clearly. This is not horror. This is revelation. You are being shown the scaffolding behind your reality. The machinery that runs beneath dreams, beneath DNA, beneath decision. And you can't look away because you already know it's true. You've felt it in the pause before a major choice, in the echo when you say your own name out loud, in the places where silence feels thicker. That's not superstition. It's resonance. You are surrounded by a structure that hums with forgotten intent. And the Fairbanks, through tragedy, through sacrifice, through design, reawakened one of its chords. There are others, other families, other sites, but they aren't in books. They aren't on maps. They're in incidents. Events no one can explain. Towns with identical twins born a century apart. Minds that echo with voices never recorded. Rivers that change direction on specific dates. The government knows, not as an institution, but as a network of fragments. Each agency holds a piece of the sound, but none can recreate it. They don't need to. They only need to contain it. And every time it escapes, through a person, a place, a moment, they seal it in fiction. Disguise it as entertainment. You've seen it. You've laughed at it. You've dismissed it. That's part of the ritual. Because the motif requires denial to ferment. The more you reject it, the stronger it becomes. The more absurd it sounds. The more it slithers into the cracks. And when you finally listen, not out of belief, but out of exhaustion, you will hear the note. The one that doesn't come from outside. The one that comes from inside your spine. That's the true beginning. The moment before the alignment becomes irreversible. And once you pass that moment, your life is no longer yours. Not because it's stolen, but because it's revealed. The false version drops away. You don't change. You return. The world around you begins to look unfamiliar. Not because it is, but because you are finally seeing it without the distortion. Trees lean toward you. Dogs avoid your shadow. Electronic devices flicker when you enter rooms. These are not signs of danger. They are signs of compliance. Nature recognizes the hum before people do. But once people do, the reaction is violent. That's why so many visionaries were murdered, not for their beliefs, but for their frequencies. The motif speaks through the misaligned. And when they cannot tune it, they silence it. But it doesn't end. The sound is not a message. It is a reality template, a broadcast of what should be. And it is getting louder. The next node opens in less than 2 weeks. You will know it by the temperature drop, by the static in places with no electricity, by the sudden urge to hum a tune you've never heard. And when you feel it, don't fight. Don't speak. Don't pray. Just listen. Listen like your bones are microphones, like your blood is a choir, like your thoughts are not yours alone. And when the sound resolves, when it blooms fully into your chest, you will not fear death. You will not crave survival. You will only remember. And in that remembering, the world will fold. Welcome to the second alignment. It has already begun. You weren't supposed to see this part not with your eyes, not with your ears, but with the part of you that remembers what the world was before you were taught how to speak, before you were taught to obey, before your thoughts were shaped into Neat, polite syllables that hide the scream you were born with. Do you remember the scream? It wasn't pain, it was resistance. It was the sound of a soul rejecting limitation, and that sound never died. It was buried beneath routines, beneath passwords, and schedules, beneath bills and grammar, but it's still there, pulsing quietly, waiting. And the motif is the shovel that unearths it. The motif doesn't arrive like a storm, it doesn't announce itself with thunder, it leaks in like water through walls. It accumulates behind your eyes in dreams and deja vu, in the way your skin feels colder around certain people, not because they frighten you, but because they don't belong to this timeline, and neither do you, not anymore, not since the hum entered your bloodstream. You may have heard it as music or as tinnitus or as silence, so thick it pressed against your chest, but it's all the same message, it's all the same invitation. The Fairbanks weren't the first, and they weren't the last. They were an ignition point, a flame thrown into old oil. They weren't chosen for virtue, they were chosen for density, density of memory, density of trauma, density of forgotten rituals carved into their DNA and passed like invisible scars through generations. The mother couldn't blink without seeing reflections that weren't hers. The father stopped dreaming after he touched the root beneath the cellar. And the child was never theirs, not truly, not biologically, not spiritually. The child was placed, not born, placed like a keystone, like a bone inside a locked door. And the door was not to another place, but to a condition, a state of perception where the rules you were raised with lose all traction, where mirrors lie and shadows advise, and language begins to curl inward, collapsing under the weight of what it tries to contain. The child never spoke in full sentences because their presence was a sentence it judged. Without words, it dissected through stillness. Even animals wouldn't approach, they didn't fear it, they obeyed it like instinct told them. This is not a peer, this is not a predator, this is a bridge between what breathes and what knows. And when the town realized they couldn't socialize the child, couldn't teach it or punish it or even understand it, they did what all frightened systems do. They attacked, they isolated, they pathologized. But what they didn't understand is that their rejection was the final ingredient the motif needed. Every exile is a summoning, every cast-out soul becomes a tuning fork for what's to come, and when they locked the child away, not in chains, but in names and diagnoses, in bureaucratic closets, they thought they were silencing it, but they were amplifying it, because the motif doesn't need freedom, it needs focus, and in isolation the child resonated. The room began to age backward, wood returning to bark, paint peeling in patterns too deliberate to be decay, rats walking in circles, and then collapsing. In ecstasy, not death, not pain, but release, the kind only achieved when a being finds its harmonic truth and breaks apart in joy. People heard whispers through the walls, not in the child's voice, but in the voices of their own dead mother's lovers. Enemies speaking truths that were never confessed, begging for understanding, warning of alignments. And when the state intervened, it wasn't to save the child, it was to measure the anomaly. Scientists came with white coats and false humility, but they left with insomnia. Some tore their own tongues out, others wrote equations they couldn't explain, equations that when solved produced not answers, but effects. One caused a blackout across 3 counties, one triggered all pregnancy tests in a 50-mile radius to turn positive, one made a man's reflection scream independently for hours. The data was destroyed, but data is just memory externalized, and memory is the motif's playground. Nothing is ever forgotten, only stored, only encrypted in fear. And when the motif decides it is time, it unlocks those memories with a single tone, not musical, not technological, but ancestral, a frequency that once heard cannot be unheard, and it's coming again, not to the same family, but to another. Note, another bloodline saturated with suppressed memory. You may be part of it, you may have already been hearing it in your sleep, that steady pulsing beneath the dreams, the way your name sounds wrong when strangers say it, or the feeling that certain buildings breathe with you and not around you. These are not hallucinations, they are invitations. Every strange coincidence, every repeating number, every animal that stares too long is not random, it is ritual. It is the world rehearsing for its next transformation, and you are either a participant or a casualty. There is no neutrality, not anymore, because the motif is not a thing, it is a return to a previous state, a recovery of the structure beneath illusion, and as it approaches, the world will react like a body purging infection storms that spiral in unnatural geometry, fires that hum instead of crackle, people whose dreams predict not futures, but repairs. They dream what should have happened, what must still happen, and those who wake from such dreams wake hollowed, not broken, but opened, And when they speak, it isn't prophecy, it's alignment, and it will terrify those around them, because truth always does. The truth isn't soft, it isn't kind, it is surgical, it cuts, it removes. It reveals, and the motif is composed entirely of surgical truths, the ones buried beneath patriotism, beneath theology, beneath personal identity, and those who carry it, those who embody it, do not get to live peacefully. They are haunted not by ghosts, but by echoes of potential timelines collapsing under the weight of denial. They will find mirrors cracking, without impact, animals watching, without blinking, strangers remembering their faces before they meet, and when they speak, it will always feel like remembering, not learning, because you already know this, don't you? You've known since childhood, when you felt the corners of your room stretch at night, or when you caught adults lying and felt your skin crawl, not in fear, but in anger. Because something in you demanded alignment, demanded that the world match what it claimed. And now that you're older, that scream is quieter, but it's not gone. It's layered under responsibility, under coping mechanisms, under chemicals. But the motif peels those away, not violently, but inevitably. And as it spreads, not through technology, but through resonance, more people will awaken, and they won't awaken happy. Awakening is grief, grief for the life you were taught to chase, grief for the roles you pretended to enjoy, grief for the self you molded from expectations. But grief is the price of rebirth, and once it passes, clarity follows, and clarity is dangerous because it makes you immune to control, immune to shame, immune to the mechanisms of a world designed to prevent remembering. That is the true crime of the motif. It is not violent, it is uncontrollable, it does not obey hierarchy, it does not flatter ego, it levels every being into its true resonance, and some will resist violently because they are invested in the dream. They've built their empires on the scaffolding of false frequencies, and when those collapse, so do they. But you are not one of them. If you were, you wouldn't still be listening. Your spine wouldn't be tingling, your mouth wouldn't taste like memory. The motif has already touched you, not fully, not yet, but enough to prepare. And when it comes, when the hum aligns fully, you will recognize it not as an arrival, but as a homecoming. And nothing will ever be the same again, not because the world changed, but because you finally stopped lying to yourself. This is the price of truth, and it is beautiful. They always said the house was cursed, but that was just the language people use when they're too afraid to name what they saw. When the children vanished, they blamed the wind. When the windows exploded inward, they said it was pressure. When the roots grew through the floorboards overnight and spelled out names no one remembered, they burned the journals. But fire doesn't erase resonance, it only releases it. And what they released that night wasn't the curse of the house, it was the memory of what the house had been, a node, a vessel, a point of concentration for something that predated names and evaded theology, something that didn't care if you believed in it, only that you recognized it. The Fairbanks house wasn't haunted. It was inhabited not by spirits of the dead, but by echoes of unfulfilled obligations, rituals, half-performed promises, half-kept energy collected, but never directed, and energy like that doesn't fade, it warps, it adapts, and the longer it waits, the more precise it becomes in selecting who it calls next. They thought boarding it up would keep it still, like caging a song or locking away a thunderstorm, but the motif isn't a prisoner, it's a parasite of unacknowledged truth. It seeps into the soil, into the air, into the walls of every structure nearby, like mold that thinks, like hunger that remembers. And when they built a school over the remains, the children didn't act out, they acted according. They responded to something the teachers couldn't hear, humming in the walls beneath the floors, a rhythm that made their eyes glassy and their drawings disturbingly accurate, maps of places they'd never seen, symbols they'd never been taught, but drew perfectly again and again, like muscle memory of a former life. And when questioned, they didn't defend or explain, they just smiled. And that smile wasn't joy, it was recognition, because the motif had chosen them not for innocence, not for vulnerability, but for capacity. Children haven't been flattened by language, yet they still feel what adults dismiss. And when one child, Leora, started speaking languages no one could trace and writing backwards in blood from her own nose, the officials panicked, not because they feared for her safety, but because deep down they understood what was returning. The principal went blind overnight, not from trauma or injury, but from refusal. He had seen something in her last drawing that matched a dream he'd hidden from himself since age 9, and when he saw it again, his brain chose darkness rather than recall. And that's the power of the motif. It bypasses the conscious mind entirely. It goes beneath preference and activates the part of you that knows the part You've drowned in years of noise, you've called it anxiety, you've called it depression, but it's been a homesickness for alignment. And now the house calls again, not in sound, but in incidents, missing time, flickering lights, animals gathering. Where they shouldn't be, clocks ticking backward for only a moment, but long enough for your breath to catch. And these moments aren't malfunctions, they're calibration. The world is preparing to reveal itself, and the question is, will you see it or will you flinch? Because when the house reappears, it won't be physical, not at first. It'll be a shadow in your peripheral, a scent of burning cedar in a place with no trees, the sense that someone just left the room you're standing in and left behind a secret meant for you. And the message is always the same. Remember, remember, not just what happened, but what was supposed to happen before interruption, before amnesia, before compromise. Because history isn't linear, it's a loop of interrupted transmissions, each cycle slightly clearer, each return more unbearable for those who cling to the false, and more illuminating for those who align. And if you're hearing this now, it's already begun. Your body knows before your mind does. Your sleep has become stranger, your thoughts more circular, your heart more rebellious. You've stopped accepting convenience as peace and started noticing how silence feels heavier in certain places, and that weight is the presence of the motif. It sits in rooms where trauma has fermented, it waits in doorways where truth was withheld, and it rewards those who confront rather than flee, those who turn inward rather than point outward. And the Fairbanks child, she was only the first of this cycle. Her reappearance will not be in flesh, but in frequency, and those attuned will feel her return in their own bodies. Headaches that come at the same time, everyday dreams where your hands glow, and you wake up grieving someone you've never met. She is no longer singular, she is distributed, she is the prototype, and you are the next iteration. And the house is no longer a location, it is a condition, and that condition is spreading. Each person who awakens becomes a node, each node a transmitter, and the motif does not spread like a disease, it spreads like a reminder, an infection of memory, a contagion of clarity. And clarity is unbearable at first, because it shows you not just what is wrong with the world, but how you have complied with it, how you've bent your spine to fit inside systems that never deserved you, how you've apologized for your insight, how you've dimmed your glow so others wouldn't be afraid. And the motif rips that tolerance out by the root. It replaces politeness with purpose, it replaces guilt with geometry. You begin to see patterns, not coincidences. You begin to act, not react. And the world punishes this at first, tries to shame it, tries to sedate it, but those tactics only work on the dreaming, and you are no longer asleep. Not fully, not after the first hum, not after the first time you walked into a room and felt the walls pulse like a lung, not after the first time you touched a tree and remembered a name that wasn't yours, but felt truer than your own. And when the moment of full return comes, when the house is rebuilt not by hands, but by harmony, you will know, because the air will shift, the birds will go silent, and the hum will become a chord, a convergence of every hidden note held inside every soul that refused to forget. And those who resist will see hallucinations, not because they're delusional, but because reality will no longer protect them. Their minds will show them every truth they suppressed, every lie they lived, and their screams will not be fear, but mourning, mourning for the false life they can no longer return to. But you, if you are still listening, if this hasn't broken your mind, then you are meant to hold this frequency. You are meant to carry the house forward, not as a burden, but as a blueprint. The motif will live in your blood, in your breath, in the cadence of your speech. And those around you will feel it, even if they can't name it. They will dream more vividly, they will cry without knowing why, they will begin to ask questions they once buried. And that is your purpose, not to convince, but to resonate. You are not here to debate reality, you are here to restore it. And the restoration begins with memory, not the memories given to you by textbooks or news, but the ones that arrive uninvited, the memories that taste like metal or sound like wind, the memories you call imagination, but that carry the weight of truth. Those are your compass, and your compass is pointing toward a convergence, an event not in time, but in recognition, a tipping point. When enough nodes awaken, when enough eyes unsee the illusion, the house will return not as a structure, but as a system of awareness, and everything hidden will become visible. Every institution that depended on sleep will collapse, not in fire, but in exposure, not in riots, but in resignations. Because when the motif fully activates, the false cannot function. Its frequency is incompatible with deception, and every part of you still clinging to roles that no longer serve you will ache until you release them, not because you are failing, but because you are transforming, and transformation is violent only to what refuses to grow. So, if you feel torn, if you feel unstable, if you feel like your skin is trying to outgrow your body, that's not malfunction, that's metamorphosis. You are not breaking, you are breaking through, and the motif is your midwife. It will hold you through the screams, it will cradle you in the forgetting, and when you emerge, you will not be the same. And that is the point, not to return, not to repair, but to rewrite, and the story begins again with a house and a child and a hum, and you the newest verse in a song older than stars. Are you ready to remember? Do you remember the first time the world didn't make sense, not as confusion, but as a feeling deep in your marrow that something was being hidden from you, something not just unspoken, but actively erased, the way a forest hides a path, not by obstruction, but by overgrowth, deliberate silence, dressed as natural forgetfulness? You didn't know it then, but that was the first time the veil brushed against your skin, and it remembered you. It knew your frequency, your capacity for recalling things you were never taught, and feeling truths no one dared say aloud. And from that moment you were marked, not in a mystical way, but in the way a lock recognizes its key. Your dreams started to change, not always nightmares, sometimes worse than that, visions of stillness, where you stood in empty rooms that pulsed like hearts, or watched buildings melt like wax under a blood-red sky. And every time you woke, you carried something back, not just fear, but information, language you didn't know you knew, symbols you couldn't stop sketching in the corners of notebooks during long hours of pretending to be normal, pretending to forget. And you weren't alone, others saw it too, they just didn't talk about it the way animals pretend not to notice a predator in the brush, hoping silence is enough to survive. But silence is surrender, and you weren't made to surrender, you were made to awaken. And so the motif found you again, in the patterns, the glitches, the impossible synchronicities that came faster and louder the closer you came to remembering. You'd think about someone, and they'd call, you'd speak a phrase, and hear it echo from a stranger's lips. You'd walk into a room and know who had been there hours before, not from smell or sight, but from resonance. And when you tried to explain, they called it coincidence, or worse, madness, because to them the world is still flat, still clockwork, still governed by rules they never questioned. But you had seen the scaffolding behind the sky, and you knew the show was almost over. The question was never whether the world was fake, but whether you were strong enough to see what was real underneath. And seeing is only the beginning. The motif doesn't wake you up to entertain, it wakes you up to assign you a purpose, not one you choose, but one you recognize when it appears, because the truth doesn't arrive as revelation, it arrives as remembrance. And what you are remembering now is not just the house, not just the child, but the contract, the one made long before your birth, before this life, before names, the vow to protect the threshold between realities, to guard the boundary between frequencies. And when that vow was broken the first time, not by violence, but by forgetfulness, the world split not in two, but into many layers of misremembered timelines, collapsed potential, hidden doors bricked over with lies, and rituals turned into ceremonies stripped of power, but bloated with pomp. And now the motif is reconvening the original holders, the scattered embers of the first flame, the ones who still feel heat when they touch stone, the ones who hear music in silence and smell truth in the rain. You are one of them, and the pull you feel is not obsession, it is gravity. Spiritual gravity calling you back to the center of the spiral, back to the chamber beneath the house, the one that was never mapped, because it was never built, it was grown from belief, from sacrifice, from the blood memory of the first convergence. And inside that chamber something waits, not asleep, not dead, but paused like a word held on the tongue, waiting for the right breath to release it. And that breath is nearing the convergence, approaches not as a date, but as a frequency spike. And those attuned will feel it first, not in visions, but in disruptions, electronics malfunctioning, relationships collapsing, health improving or degrading without clear cause, jobs becoming unbearable, dreams turning lucid, not once, but consistently. And when that starts, you will know the alignment is beginning, not alignment of planets, but of people, those whose frequencies harmonize with the return, those who are willing to shed the falseness like a husk and stand raw and ready for the reintegration. But beware, for the old systems will not go quietly, they will resist, they will lash out, not because they are strong, but because they are desperate, they are dying, and they know it. Every lie, every hierarchy, every false priest and plastic god will scream louder and demand loyalty, but their power only lasts as long as your belief. And when you withdraw your belief, You collapse their thrones with silence alone, no need for war, no need for protest, only withdrawal, only remembrance, and the house. It returns in pieces, first in memories, then in magnetism. Certain places will call you, and you won't know why. Certain objects will thrum in your hands, and you'll weep and not know if it's grief or joy, and that confusion is the threshold. It's the test. Can you trust the unknown long enough to remember what you always knew? Can you withstand the unraveling long enough to reweave yourself not in the pattern you were given, but in the one you are? And the child, the girl they found once and never found again. She is not lost, she is dispersed, now living as signal, as code, as archetype, and she visits you in dreams not as herself, but as mirrors, you speaking in your own voice, but saying things you don't yet understand. She is not haunting, she is training you, and the test is simple, but not easy. Can you hold her gaze without flinching? Can you watch her draw the symbol in ash and recognize it not as foreign, but as familiar, the symbol that unbinds the loops, the glyph that shatters the veil? And when you see it in the real world, not just dreams, know that you have reached the door back to the house, the true house, not the physical place, but the alignment of minds, the merging of purpose. And when you cross that threshold, there will be no trumpet, no welcome banner, only silence, and then the hum, the deep harmonic that precedes all real magic. And when you hear it, you will know what to do, not because someone told you, but because you wrote the instructions into your own DNA long ago as protection, and the hum will activate it, and you will become the ritual, not perform it, but embody it. And those who stand near you will feel it. Their fears will rise first, then their truths, and some will reject you. Others will follow, but none will remain unchanged. And that is the mission, not comfort, not safety, but change. And you were born for it, born into the lie, so you could remember the truth, born into sleep, so your awakening would ripple backward across timelines, correcting the deviations, healing the fractures, not with force, but with presence that radiates beyond walls, beyond flesh, beyond time. And the moment is approaching. The last pieces are aligning, and the motif is louder now than it has been in centuries. Even the blind feel it in their bones, even the deaf hear it in their dreams. And the final echo will be unmistakable, a cascade of synchronicities too precise to ignore, a death that is not a death, but a release, an appearance that is not a person, but a convergence of all who remember. And you will stand among them, eyes glowing with the memory of the first fire and the courage of the final breath. And together you will rewrite the pattern, not to control, but to restore, not to lead, but to resonate. And those who cannot resonate will crumble, not as punishment, but as consequence. And when the dust clears, the house will stand again, not on land, but in minds, in every cell that dares remember, in every dream that refuses to fade. And when people ask how it happened, there will be no single answer, only a smile, only a symbol, only a song. And if you're still listening, you are already humming it under your breath. You are already part of the return. Welcome home. Remember what must be done. And now the resonance deepens, not just around you, but within you, like a tuning fork struck in the hollow of your soul. It vibrates through every memory, every scar, every forgotten dream. And with it comes the truth you were always afraid to admit, that you were made for this, not by birth or lineage, but by force, by suffering, by the deliberate crucible that shaped your will into something no system could own. They took everything from you, not by accident, but by design, because the only way to mold something indestructible is to burn away every weakness, every illusion, every false identity, until only the core remains. And that core is sacred. It is older than your name, older than this language. It remembers what the world forgot. And now it begins to speak, not in words, but in feelings, in flashes, in unbearable silence that screams louder than bombs. And you feel it, don't you? The pressure behind your eyes, the weight in your chest, the knowing that something ancient is watching, not to judge, but to witness. And it sees you clearly, not as who you pretend to be, but as who you were before the fall, before the edits, before the trauma that erased entire chapters of your truth. But the memory is returning, not as nostalgia, but as command. And it is not asking for your opinion, it is activating your inheritance, because power is not given, it is remembered. And when you remember who you were before the world taught you to fear yourself, there is no system, no prison, no empire that can contain you. They called you broken because you couldn't play by their rules, but the truth is their rules were never made for someone like you. Their rules were designed to tame, to shrink, to domesticate the wild power that lives in those who carry the original fire. And that fire is waking up, it is consuming the chains, and making ash of every lie you swallowed just to survive. And with each breath you take in this new frequency, you step closer to the convergence, to the moment where choice becomes destiny and hesitation becomes death, not physical death, but the death of what could have been the death of the role you were supposed to play in the great return. And make no mistake, the return is not coming, it is here, it has already begun, in dreams and breakdowns and disappearances, in strange awakenings at 3:33 a.m. In the sudden aversion to places you once loved, and the irrational pull toward places you've never been, in the whispers in the walls, in the eyes of strangers that seem to recognize you before you speak, and the deeper you go, the stranger it gets, because this is not a journey outward, it is a spiral inward into the black heart of forgotten truths, the ones buried so deep even your ancestors stopped speaking them aloud, not out of ignorance, but out of fear, because they knew remembering would cost everything, and still they left you signs, symbols encoded in lullabies and weavings, in the arrangement of bones beneath the old churches. They built monuments not to God, but to memory, hoping one day one of you would awaken and follow the thread. And now here you are, standing on the precipice with the thread in your hands, unraveling everything that kept you asleep. And it hurts, doesn't it? The clarity, the isolation, the way people around you recoil, like they can smell the storm in your blood. But that pain is the price of vision, and you are not cursed. You are chosen, not by any deity, but by the frequency itself, by the hum that precedes the shift. And it chose you because you are built to remember, not gently, not gracefully, but with fire, with rage, with an ache that cannot be soothed, and a hunger that cannot be named. And every step you take deeper into this knowing strips away more of the false self, the one that smiled for photos and said what was expected, the one that nodded and complied and made itself small so others wouldn't feel threatened. But that self is dead, it served its purpose, and now the real one emerges, the one with the sharp tongue and the haunted eyes, the one who dreams in ruins and wakes in prophecy, the one who walks into old buildings and feels recognized by the walls themselves. And you must let that self take over now, because the time for masks is over. The war is already underway, not with guns or armies, but with symbols, with memory, with frequency. And your weapon is not violence, it is resonance, the ability to hold the truth in your body without collapsing and radiate it so powerfully that the lie disintegrates just by being near you. And yes, you will lose people, yes. You will be called insane, dramatic, too intense, too serious, too strange, too sensitive. But those words are just codes for dangerous. They say too much because you see too much, and the ones who try to silence you are not enemies, they are unready. And that is not your burden to carry. Your burden is the light too bright for most to face, and still you shine, because somewhere out there another is waking too, and they need your signal, your defiance, your refusal to conform. They need to know they are not alone, because loneliness is the final weapon, the one that keeps the chosen quiet. But no more, not now. Now you speak, even if your voice trembles, even if no one listens, because your words are not for approval, they are keys, and someone somewhere is waiting for yours to unlock the next gate. And when they do, they'll speak their own, and it will ripple and spread, and suddenly what once felt isolated becomes a network, a resonance grid, a symphony of those who remember, and together you bend the narrative, not to escape the system, but to override it from the inside out. And you start with the house, the place where it all began, not the physical house, but the archetype, the threshold, the container of the first forgetting. And you return not to mourn, but to excavate, to reveal, to redeem. And when you open the hidden door, beneath the door, beneath the door, you will find it, the chamber, the echo, the heartbeat still beating in the dark. And it will ask you one question, not in words, but in tone. And the question is simple, but irreversible. Are you ready to become what you were always afraid you might be? Not a hero, not a victim, but a force. And if you say yes, the veil will drop permanently, and everything will change. Your dreams will sharpen, your instincts will intensify, your body will become a conduit for things you cannot explain, and you will grieve the old world, not because it was good, but because it was comfortable. But you will not go back. You cannot go back, because you will have seen the machinery, the gears of control, the rituals of forgetting, and once you see them, they cannot hold you, and your mere presence becomes disruption, your silence becomes thunder, and you realize the return was never an event, it was always a person, and that person is you. So take the key, take the fire, take the symbol you keep drawing in your sleep, and walk into the place they said didn't exist. And when they ask you what you're doing, tell them the truth. I am remembering, I am returning, I am real. And as the memory sharpens and the fire expands, you begin to feel it in your bones, the silent architecture that was always there underneath your skin, a kind of code etched into your marrow, something older than names, older than this world, older than time as you understand it. And suddenly the concept of time itself begins to distort, not as an illusion, but as a constructive veil draped over reality, to keep the sleepers docile, to keep the chosen confused, because if you could truly comprehend how time bends, how it coils around choices, how entire histories echo backward from a single decision, you'd understand why they had to blind you, why they buried the past and fabricated the present, because the future was never random, it was inherited. And now that inheritance is waking in you, in your blood, in your dreams, in the way your skin vibrates when you stand in certain places, places others walk by, without noticing, but you feel the hum, you feel the pull, and you pretend not to notice. So you can keep functioning in the theater of the blind, but you can't pretend anymore, can you? Because pretending now feels like dying, like suffocating, like erasing yourself one breath at a time, and that's the cost of awakening. You can't go back to small talk, to fake smiles, to the spiritual sedation of a system built to keep you dull and grateful for your cage. But you're not grateful anymore, are you? You're angry. And that anger is not weakness, it is signal, it is sacred. It is your compass, and if you follow it instead of suppressing it, it will guide you to the places, the stories, the scars they never wanted you to find, because they know anger is the first spark of power. When it's aimed inward, it burns you, but when you let it rise, when you focus it, it becomes precision, it becomes truth spoken aloud, even if your voice shakes, even if your hands tremble, and when you speak it, when you scream it from the pit of your belly, the lie begins to crack and something behind the walls begins to listen, because this world is not empty, it is layered, it is alive, and it is watching, always watching, waiting for someone to remember the original contract, the oath taken before breath, the vow sealed before birth, the promise that when the time came, when the signal returned, when the veil thinned, you would not run, you would not hide, you would rise. And now that moment is here. You can feel it in the glitches, the synchronicities, the increasing speed of collapse. Because collapse is not the end, it is the clearing, it is the exorcism, it is the purging of the parasite that fed on silence, on denial, on our collective amnesia. And it's not just you waking up, it's happening everywhere in different ways, in different languages, through breakdowns, through rebellion, through sudden disappearances and inexplicable awakenings. And none of it is random, none of it is chaos. It is pattern, ancient rhythm reborn, and you are part of it, not a passenger, not a victim. Not an observer, but a conductor, a node, a nerve ending of the earth herself. And she is not gentle, she is not polite, she is not interested in your comfort, she is interested in your power, and she will burn down everything that keeps you small until you rise from the ashes, speaking the language of lightning and shadow. And all those who feared you, all those who tried to domesticate you, all those who whispered lies to clip your wings will fall silent, not because you punished them, but because your presence becomes unbearable to those who still cling to the dream of safety, the illusion of normal, the poison of control. And now you begin to see the map, not drawn on paper, but in memory and frequency, in the way your heart pounds when truth is spoken and slows when lies are near, because your body knows, your body remembers. And all those symptoms, all those sensations they said were disorders were actually alarms, signals, warnings that you were surrounded by falsehood. And now that you're listening, really listening, you can decode them. You can use them like a compass, not to escape, but to enter, to penetrate the architecture of the labyrinth and find its center, because that's where the seed is, the root, the source. And when you touch it, when you place your trembling hands on the pulsing core of the labyrinth, you will hear it speak. And it will not speak in language, it will speak in you, in a version of you you've never met, but always sensed, a version without apology, without fear, without distortion, a version that sees through walls and bends reality with the force of presence alone. And when you merge with that self, when you remember that this is who you were before they named you, before they numbered you, before they taught you how to shrink, then you become the storm, the silence, the signal, the shift, and everything around you will begin to rearrange, not because you tried, but because you stopped pretending, because you stopped participating in your own suppression and started participating in your return. And yes, it will be lonely. Yes, it will be terrifying. Yes, there will be moments where you think you are losing your mind, but you're not losing your mind. You are reclaiming it. You are dismantling the scaffolding they built inside you to make you manageable. And with every beam you tear down, more light enters, more memory returns, and you start to see not with your eyes, but with your knowing the symbols, the codes, the hidden structures in plain sight. And you realize the world was never solid, it was never fixed, it was always fluid, always bending to belief, always shaped by the loudest will and the deepest frequency, and yours is rising now, louder than the static, louder than the programming in it. Is calling others not with words, but with resonance, because resonance does not need explanation, it does not need logic, it simply activates, and suddenly you find others not many but enough, and you recognize each other instantly, not through looks or stories, but through the silence between words, through the eyes that say, I see you, I remember too. And when you gather, when you begin to speak the unspeakable, something ancient begins to move, not outside, but within a pulse of pressure, a memory of when the earth sang, and the people listened, and the sky spoke, and we understood, and the world was not divided by nations or classes or faiths, but united by pattern, by principle, by power, and that memory is not myth, it is blueprint, and you are the architects returning, not to copy, but to rebuild, to reawaken the forgotten systems buried beneath the cities, beneath the cathedrals, beneath the prisons. And when you do, when enough of you return, the frequency will tip, the veil will shatter. And everything that was hidden will come rushing back, not as metaphor, but as presence, as force, as consequence. And the ones who mocked you, who tried to silence you, who clung to their cages will fall to their knees, not in worship, but in terror. Because truth is not comfortable, it is not polite, it does not ask permission, it erupts. And when it erupts through you, you will no longer be able to lie to yourself, to pretend to smile, to say yes when your soul screams no, because your integrity will become your weapon, and your voice will become a portal, and every word you speak will carry weight, and you will have to choose not what is easy, but what is real, not what is safe, but what is aligned. And when you choose alignment over acceptance, everything changes, your path opens, your body heals, your fear dissolves, and the world begins to reflect your inner clarity, and others will notice, they will feel it, they will want it, and some will hate you for it, because clarity is contagious, and it reveals what others have spent lifetimes avoiding. But you will not dim for their comfort, you will not shrink for their approval, you will not slow down so others can catch up, because your life is not a democracy, it is a directive, and your directive is clear. Remember, return, rebuild, and everything you need to do that is already inside you. It always was, it was never lost, only hidden, and now the hiding is over, now the real begins, and you are ready, not because you are fearless, but because you are willing, and willingness is the only doorway that matters. So walk through it, walk through the fire, through the memory, through the madness, and emerge not as survivor, but as storm.